день, дорогие друзья! Вас приветствует телепрограмма «Спутник». С вами Элина Редди. Сегодня мы в Сиднее, на северном побережье, в доме моих друзей. Несколько лет назад я здесь познакомилась с очень интересным человеком. Как оказалось, она австралийская писательница Лиан Мориарти. Да, та самая успешная писательница за всю историю Австралии. Лиан Мориарти работает в жанре современной прозы. За 16 лет своей творческой деятельности она написала 3 книги для детей в жанре сказочного фэнтези и 8 романов для взрослых, которые стали международными бестселлерами. Ее книги переведены на 39 языков, и более чем 14 миллионов копий было продано. CBS Films приобрели права на экранизацию ее книг. HBO-сериал «Большая маленькая ложь» произвел грандиозный успех. Там снимались большие звезды Голливуда, как Николь Кидман, Риз Уизерспун и Мерил Стрип. Сейчас Николь Кидман готовится к съемкам по новому роману Лиан Мориарти, который называется «9 идеальных незнакомцев». Она будет играть главную героиню, русскую иммигрантку из Украины. Ну а кто помог Лиан Мориарти разработать типаж главной героини? Это у меня для вас, мои дорогие телезрители, маленький сюрприз. Liane, thank you very much for appearing on Sputnik TV.
My pleasure.
Can you please tell us, how did you become an author?
Well, it all started when I was a little girl and I used to love to write stories, so much so that my father used to commission me and my little sister to write stories for him. So he would pay $1.50 for an exercise book filled with words. So he basically gave us our first publishing deals. But as I got older, I used to write lots, but as I became a teenager, I started to lose confidence in my writing, so I wrote less and less. I always had a career that involved writing of some sort, so I went into advertising and marketing, and I wrote things like TV commercials and the back of the Sultana brand box. But it wasn't until my little sister got her first publishing deal, and so she called me up to say that her first book, Feeling Sorry for Celia, had been accepted for publication.
What's her name?
Her name is Liane Moriarty. Of course I was very pleased for her because I love her dearly, but I was also filled with envy. And also, to be honest, a sort of rage, really. And the rage was directed at myself because she'd gone ahead and achieved our childhood dream and I hadn't even given it a try. So that was what spurred me on to write my first novel, which was 3 Wishes.
Oh, a bit of competitive spirit.
Yes, that's right. It helped.
How did you choose what genre to write in?
I didn't really choose a genre at all, not consciously. I just wrote, so my first book, 3 Wishes, I wrote as part of a master's degree at Macquarie University here in Sydney. And I just made up a story and went with it. And because I know all about sisters, because I'm one of 5 sisters, I wrote a story just about family. And I guess you would call that genre women's fiction. That's what they like to call it, because any story about, well, first of all, any story written by a woman, they tend to call women's fiction, and any story about family and relationships, it seems to get that category. But then with The Hypnotist's love story, which I think was my 3rd novel, I started to play with the elements of suspense. And then I really went for it with The Husband's Secret. So I think I took a turn then.
I felt like it was a real thriller.
Yes, it was more of a thriller. And so I guess that that genre has come to be called domestic thrillers. But I prefer not to think of myself as writing in any particular genre. It's just what I fall into. When I sit down, I just want to write a story, and it's up to the publishers and the bookshops and everybody else to tell me what my genre is.
How do you get the inspiration for your characters and the storyline?
Well, it comes from all around me, so from overheard conversations in coffee shops, from things that happen to me, from things that I read. So, for example, with The Husband's Secret, I read an article on deathbed confessions. So, for example, I read a story about the man who admitted on his deathbed that he had lied about finding the Loch Ness Monster. So he'd taken a photo of the Loch Ness Monster and he admitted that he'd made it all up. So there were all things like that, and I thought, obviously, when you have a secret like that, it weighs on you so much. So The Husband's Secret is about somebody with a terrible secret that he writes a letter to his wife to be opened in the event of his death. So that's what inspired that one. And What Alice Forgot was also inspired by an article I read. So I read about a woman who lost her memory, and she thought that, she had an accident, and she thought that she was a teenager. So she had no memory of the years since she was a teenager. And what fascinated me so much about that story was that she became like her teenage self. So that made me think so she was quite grumpy, and she had children, and she wasn't particularly interested in her children. So that made me think, so losing your memory is like a form of time travel. So it takes you back to the person you were before. So that's how the premise of What Alice Forgot. She loses 10 years of her memory. She thinks she's happily married and pregnant with her first child, and in fact she's in the middle of a terrible divorce with 3 children. But because she's gone back in time, in her mind, she's still blissfully in love.
How did you get your big break?
Well, I guess in my career there's been a few breaks. The first would be being published in the first place. So I did have one children's book. It was around the time of the Sydney 2000 Olympics. So I wrote a book about as if animals were all in the Olympics. I was inspired by the Olympics. And that book was enthusiastically rejected by every publisher in Australia. But then my first novel, 3 Wishes, was immediately accepted by Pam McMillan. And then when I look back on my career, I would think my next break would be The Husband's Secret, because that really took off in America. And so that reached the top of the New York Times bestseller list. And thinking, what was it that helped me get that break? It was probably because people like Stephen King, Anne Lamott, some other authors said nice things about my books, so that helped drive people to it. Yes, exactly. Yes. And then after that, the next book after The Husband's Secret was Big Little Lies, and that was picked up for the HBO series. So that brought me a whole lot of new readers and took me up another level.
What was that experience like to have Hollywood adapt one of your successful novels into a mini-series? What was that experience like for you?
It was wonderful. It was great fun, to be honest. That was the main thing. It was just so interesting to me because I didn't have any experience with that field. So just to be able to go visit the set. I was there on the night when they were actually filming the trivia night, which is, the big climax of the series. So I was lucky enough to be there then. Just to see all the actors, to see people like Nicole Kidman and Reese Witherspoon and Laura Dern saying lines that I'd written. It was surreal and strange and wonderful. But I do always like to say that still the thing that gives me the most pleasure is being somewhere and seeing someone reading my book. So that's because that's just me and the reader. So I'm hugely grateful for Big Little Lies and for the interest that Hollywood has taken in me, but it's really personal, that connection that I have between myself, my imagination, and the reader's imagination.
Well, I guess it's probably why you write maybe in the first place.
Yes, that's right. That's what matters. So that's why I always say I hate to think, some people say, I hope they make a movie of your next book, and I always say, but that's not my end goal. My end goal is the book, and it's a wonderful perk if this Hollywood side of my life, but it's not my goal.
Just going back to the statistics and your success, in 2014 you had three of your novels being on the New York Times bestseller list simultaneously, and it is achieved only by very, very few people in the whole world. What was that like?
Well, I guess
could you believe it? Oh my God, this has happened.
I guess it was a strange feeling, and it didn't feel quite real because at that point I wasn't so well known in Australia. So, they were telling me that this is happening, but it felt like a parallel world where, I'd go to America and I'd get off the plane and there would be all my books in bookshops, and then I'd come back home and nobody would know me. So it was strange. So my husband used to say, it's our job as Australians to keep you grounded so you don't get too pleased with yourself.
So Liane, when did your success arrive in Australia? How much longer after you became very famous and overseas?
It's hard to remember. I think it was probably, and it was a gradual process. So it was probably by the time the series of Big Little Lies came out that people started to take notice. And I like to say that I definitely had my Australian readers. I have very loyal Australian readers, just not as many as I do now. So I definitely have people who come up to me at events and say, I knew you before you were cool, Liane. so they were there. But yeah, it just brought, and it often seems to happen in Australia that we need to make it somewhere else before Australians take notice of us.
Tell me a little bit about your latest novel, 9 Perfect Strangers, and your motivation behind that.
So 9 Perfect Strangers is about 9 people who go to a health resort. They're hoping for weight loss and stress relief, maybe some meditation and massages, but it turns out to be a rather different experience than what they thought they'd signed up for. And the idea for that came because when I was on tour for Big Little Lies, people would ask me, what's your next book going to be about? And I always had this standard joke that I was making, which was, my next book's going to be set on a tropical island resort, and I'm going to have to do a lot of research to get it right. But the more I started making that same joke, the more I thought to myself, actually, why not? An island resort would be a great setting for a book. But then something happened to me at a barbecue. And the thing that happened at the barbecue happened in this very house where we are now sitting.
This is exciting.
Yes, but I can't tell you what happened because that would give away the plot of Truly Madly Guilty. But that's what inspired...
By the way, I love that book.
Oh, thank you, thank you. So I can tell you secretly what happened afterwards. But that then fired up my imagination. So I put aside my island resort idea and I wrote Truly Madly Guilty. And then I was on tour for Truly Madly Guilty. On the way home I stopped in Hawaii for a holiday. And I read a book called, it was a 1930s spy sort of book, and it was set in a girls' school. And a writer goes to this school, and what I loved about it was that you felt like you yourself were becoming part of the routines of the school. And I thought, maybe instead of my island resort, I'll send my group of people to a health resort in an old house. And so then I was fascinated by the idea of creating all the rules and the procedures of the house. So what time is breakfast and all that sort of thing. So it went from there, and then it gave me an opportunity to explore, everybody's obsession with wellness, with health and wellness.
One of your characters in 9 Perfect Strangers is Russian-speaking Ukrainian. I'm just wondering, what is your perception of Russian people?
Well, I think that they, in my experience, and I remember I had a Russian client once when I was in my freelance copywriting days, and she, like you, was very glamorous, beautiful, and very, to me, very exotic seeming. So because it's a part of the world that I've never visited, and that's the reason that I made this character. So Masha runs the resort, and I wanted my guests to be enthralled by her very quickly, and so that's why I needed her to be somebody who to them they would find exotic and different. If she'd been an ordinary Australian woman, they wouldn't have been so ready to go along with her strange requests. So that's what, so I created her, and I have to admit, because I didn't have much knowledge of Russian culture, in my first draft, the character was probably a bit too cartoonish, the way you've probably over the years seen Russians portrayed in, in movies and television shows where they're the exotic villain, but without much substance to them. And so that's why I felt so lucky when I got in touch with you, and you helped make Masha so much more interesting, in-depth character.
I felt very honoured. It was my absolute pleasure.
No, well, I'm very grateful.
I just find it amazing how you describe everyday situations in some of your books, and you also talk about picture perfect, and it's on the surface, but then you dig so deep and you explore so many issues of a lot of positive things like loyalty and friendship and really good relationships, but also some negative things in the community like domestic violence and betrayal. And how do you think of all these things?
I don't know. I never plan my books, so I always just start out with the premise and then just take it from there. And then I guess what's going on in the community, so for example domestic violence, so those things are all being talked about, and then they just find their way into my books. So my books are up until now have always been set in right now, it's a contemporary setting, so it just happens naturally that various issues emerge in my books, and also of course they help drive the story. So you could have all lovely things happen, but then you need to blow things up to move the story along.
And you certainly do the real psychological thrillers. Yeah. In Nine Perfect Strangers, could you please tell how you came up with name Masha?
Oh yes, I'd nearly forgotten how I came up with the name. So the reason for that name was because she's a real person, not the character that I created, but she went to a Starlight Children's Foundation function, and she bidded for they had a charity auction as part of it, and you could bid to have your name used in one of my books.
How clever.
I know. So I got her name, and originally I thought, I'd just make her a minor character, but then when as I was saying, I needed the resort manager to be somebody exotic and different, I thought I'll use that name, and in a way that name helped inspire the whole character. So I'm grateful to her for going to that auction.
But it's also a very generous donation.
Yes, that's right, for the Starlight Foundation, yeah.
Liane, how do you juggle being a successful, best-selling international author, also being a mum and being a wife?
Well, I think really that I've got the perfect job. So when the children were little, I used to have a babysitter who would come for just 3 hours at a time, and I would do a 3-hour writing block. And nothing gave me more pleasure than to be able to hand the baby over for 3 hours and go into my office and write. But obviously if I had so many careers don't allow you to do that. So if I was an investment banker, I couldn't do 3 hours worth of investment banking and at a time that suited me. So I've always felt very lucky in that regard. Now my husband is a stay-at-home dad, which he is really enjoying. But I have to admit, I sometimes think I was probably more productive in those 3 hours where I used to only have such a short amount of time because I knew I couldn't leave my office because the babysitter was outside the door. So I find the juggle easy because I do think it's such a flexible job, and I just think I'm so lucky to be able to do my dream job. Which is not to say, of course, there are sometimes I'm on book tour and I've had to miss some event at my children's school, which does leave me feeling the typical mother's guilt that we all feel. But I don't feel guilty for that long because they get to see a lot of me.
And how do your kids feel about their mum being such a famous person?
Well, they do like to point out that, I'm not quite as successful as J.K. Rowling yet, and we don't yet live in a castle.
It's good for them to point out that you have to have aspirations.
Yes, exactly. Yes. But they enjoy it, and there are little things. Sometimes we're stopped by a reader who recognises me, and it doesn't happen often enough to be annoying, but the times that it does happen, I think it gives them a little thrill and gives me a little thrill too, so they enjoy it.
Сейчас мы находимся в том самом саду рядом с легендарным бассейном, где произошло происшествие, которое послужило основой для романа «Верные, безумные, виновные». Да-да, прямо здесь.
Liane, what is the most unique experience you have ever had?
That's a very difficult question to ask. Let me think. If I look back on my life, I think most of my experiences have actually been very ordinary, and that's what I specialise in, trying to find something extraordinary in the ordinary experiences. I've had things like skydiving, so that jumping out of an aeroplane was
You're
unique.
a brave woman.
Yes, and I'll never do it again. I was there when the Berlin Wall was coming down, and that helped inspire a plot of The Husband's Secret.
Huge moment in history
It was,
to be part of.
yes, and I haven't been part of many moments in history. I normally miss them. And, most recently was probably being there at the Emmys. So the experience of when they called out Big Little Lies as the winner of the Emmys. So walking up on stage, being terrified that I would trip. So Nicole Kidman's lovely husband was there, and he held out his hand to help me up onto the stage. And I think he was doing it just as a, gracious gesture.
You're just being a gentleman.
Yes, exactly. But I held on to him with an iron grip, and I whispered to him, "You need to help me all the way up the stairs." So I held on to him like that and got onto the stage. So it was just a very surreal feeling to think of the fact that I sat at my desk and I made up a story, and that ended with me here on stage looking out at all those famous faces. And then walking out, and there was Jane Fonda out there, just, face after face. And then back to reality, a few days later, I'm back at my desk again.
And when you said that you're normally not, you miss history, like historical moments, well, I would actually say that you make history.
That's a nice thing.
You broke quite a few records.
That's very nice. Yes, that's what I need to do, make my own historical moments.
Liane, thank you very much for being a part of Sputnik TV Australia, and thank you so much for your time.
That's my absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Я надеюсь, вы получили удовольствие от нашей телепередачи. Телепрограмма «Спутник» благодарит вас за внимание. С вами была Элина Reddy. До новых встреч!